step closer to the microphone. My whole life, I have loved being Catholic and having a huge Catholic family. My favorite memories as a kid was being in Savannah, where my mom and dad were raised. And I had an aunt that had 9 kids, and they lived on the river. And there'd be this room that was about half the size. That was their living room, because that's what you have to have when you have 9 kids. And my aunts would all be sitting in the chairs, and we'd all be on the floor, all my cousins, listening to them tell story after story. We would just hang on every word. They were like pure entertainment, and I think that's why I still say a story every 5 minutes. I got that straight from them. My mother had 7 kids in her family, and almost every one of them had anywhere between 5 and 9 kids apiece. We were the smallest of 5. I was a PE teacher and a coach for 10 years, and my husband coached everything from football to soccer to basketball to golf. So I just knew I was going to have 4 boys, no girls. And we live on a big piece of property with a big field in the back. They played football and baseball and soccer all day, and I'd be right there with them. My whole story is about God's plan over Caroline's plan, and how I had to want and pray for His will over mine, which was not easy. And how following the church's teachings taught me that their purpose was to align your life with the will of God, so He can show you that His plans and His ideas are better than anything you could have come up with. And it's a story how God always brings good out of bad, beauty out of suffering and pain, and light and fulfillment even out of wrong decisions when you turn your will over to God. Because we have a heck of a story, the most beautiful story there is. And only He could come up with it. And I'm deeply, deeply honored to get to share it with you, because He gave it to us to share. It took me a long time to find my husband, Paul. I had been in a couple of dysfunctional roller coaster relationships that by the grace of God, I did not marry. I would ask my mom, how do you know when it's the right one? And she'd say in her sweet, centered, spiritual, saintly way, you'll know. So God had to move some mountains. He brought a 23-year-old kid down here for me from Maine, 4 years younger, seemingly quiet, introverted, and reserved. Anything what you'd describe me as. But when I went on my first date, I found him talkative, deep, intellectual, and incredibly humorous. I came back to work and told my fellow PE teachers, mark my words, I'm marrying him. I knew Mom was right. He was the one. We married 2 years later, in 1996, just before I turned 30, and we immediately started to try to have kids. And 1 year went by, 2 years, 5, 7, 10. I always say the first 2 years of infertility are definitely the hardest. So how in the world do you put 10 years of infertility in a talk? And everything you have to go through, make sense of, endure, and decisions you have to discern. And everything it gave me. I can tell you this, infertility gave me 2 major things, the majority of what this talk is about. And the second thing infertility did was a profound understanding of the church, her teachings, and a deep, deep love for the Catholic faith, therefore Jesus Christ. And I say regularly, infertility became a gift. I had a hard time teaching. My kids were mostly streetwise kids with very broken homes, and because I couldn't have my own child, I had a really hard time detaching. I loved them, and I mentored them, but they wore me out. I broke up fights pretty much weekly. I was cussed out, pretty much daily. I even took a gun off of a kid during exercise. It was in his waistband, and from then on, my seniors called this the gun check stretch. I did not feel like a good teacher, and I was so anxious to have a child, leave teaching, and be a stay-at-home mom. But there was one problem. I was missing the baby. So I went to my priest for spiritual counseling, and I explained to him for like an hour and a half how complicated everything was, how I wanted to leave teaching, I wanted to raise this child, and I needed to come up with some way to be a stay-at-home mom. And what would that be? And what about the baby that I don't have? And he said, Caroline, I know you want this step-by-step explanation, and all God keeps telling me is trust. I was like, that's all you got? Trust? So I went to school that next day, and you wouldn't believe what happened. Cross Keys is a very multiracial school with a huge department, ESL, English as a Second Language. I had 2 classes of PE and health of these kids, and I had everyone from Vietnam to Iraq, Iran, Kurdistan, Mexico, Somalia, and about 10 other countries, African countries. I really loved them, and they loved me. They were the reason I was so sane in the midst of all that madness. Well, that department head pulled me aside and said, we love how you teach our kids, and we wanted to know if you would be the sole PE and health teacher only for them. I mean, out of nowhere, trust. My last 2 years of teaching were completely fulfilled, teaching those kids. And you know what else God did for me during my infertility journey? He made me an artist. Little by little, he revealed a talent in me that I would have never known or taken seriously until it was time. He foreshadowed a business that I've had now for over 20 years. I would paint these life-size paintings of athletes to put on the gym wall during the '96 Olympics because I was in charge of field day. And I would think, what if you could paint like this all day long and get paid? And then I'd laugh it off and say, who's going to pay you to paint all day? And then Paul taught woodshop and technology, and he had a technology lab room, and I painted the Jetsons on that, and I thought, wouldn't it be cool to have a job painting murals in kids' rooms like this? And then I thought, well, why wouldn't you just do it yourself? Then I took a couple of days off to take a faux finishing decorative painting class, and I was hooked. My last 2 years of teaching, God really developed an artist out of this phys ed teacher. So I came up to Paul, and I told him I thought maybe the stress of teaching was keeping us from conceiving if he'd be okay if I left teaching to go paint for people. And he said, no! Paul and I taught together at Cross Keys, and we were the junior class sponsors. We were in charge of the junior and senior prom, and he loved how I worked with the kids. So a week later, I thought, well, that went really well. Maybe I'll go ask him again. And I did, and he said yes. And I left after 10 years of teaching. During those years of infertility, I began studying the church. I read every book Scott Hahn wrote, Patrick Madrid, and others. Took every Jeff Caven's Bible study and sponsored and taught those converting to Catholicism. It should be a requirement that all people, all Catholics, sponsor someone that's going through the church. You wouldn't believe what you will learn about this 2,000-year-old church that Christ died to give us. And all the gift converts are to our Catholic faith. It's an honor to be with y'all and that have come into the church and be on your journey. It has humbled me and deepened my faith immensely. And I fell in love with the Eucharist, which truly is the source and summit of our Catholic faith. His true body and blood that he died to give us. As I frequented daily Mass, I had the most profound conversion to the church I had never left, but just had such an immature understanding of. I am forever grateful for my infertility, because I would not have had this conversion without it. I thank my mom for passing this faith on to me all the time. I couldn't have had a more perfect example of a Catholic Christian mother.
whose life exemplified turning to the church's sacraments through her own trials and sufferings. She showed us how to truly love the church, believe in it, and cling to her teachings. You see, my father was a very sick alcoholic who died when I was in the 6th grade at 42. Mom was left with 5 kids, 2 in high school and 3 in elementary. 3 years later, my 16-year-old brother died, David, in a car accident. Hold on, I'll be back with you. I watched my mother transform before my very eyes into the most holiest, humble, strongest woman I've ever witnessed. Almost daily, someone at church says, "That's your mother? I thought she was a nun." I always say, I have yet to be confused as a nun. People often confront me in awe how at peace I was not having a baby, how I could be so genuinely excited for people that conceive and attend baby showers. That was so important to me, and I always knew my ability to pray for His will and cling to those church teachings had everything to do with that peace, especially on infertility. Now that did not come easy or naturally because I was scared to death to pray those words for a long time, that I wanted His will, because you're just waiting for Him to say, okay, that's it. You're not getting a baby, because that was my will. I think my favorite scripture to refer to like this is when Abraham is willing to sacrifice his son. That's all God was doing, was testing his faith. That's all He's doing with us, is testing our faith, to show that we love and believe in Him more than we believe in ourselves and in our will, that we cling to what He wants in His perfect timing and will. When I left teaching in 2000, I had very little work with my new mural faux finishing business. So I needed a side job to supplement our income. One of my former gymnasts was leaving Tucker Wright Gymnastics and needed to have someone fill her position teaching 2- and 3-year-olds. God's sole purpose for this position was to open my heart to adoption. I had never been exposed to that many adopted kids, and many of the women were older like myself. I developed many close relationships with those mothers, and they were so patient with me when I would constantly talk about having my own baby. I would say that all the time, and they were probably like, "Sure you are." It's a good time for me to blow my nose. Two moms would say just enough and then pull back so they could have that planted in my heart. They were instrumental in my openness to the idea. I conceived one baby and was pregnant for 8 days, one of the best 8 days of my life. I felt completely fulfilled and so whole. We named the baby Hope because he or she gave us hope that we could be parents, but never dreamed how God could creatively do just that. And I could always hear God say deep, deep in my soul, "Hold on just a little longer, Caroline. I have something tailor-made for you." As I've mentioned, I love being Catholic, and here I was studying the faith, attending daily Mass, but do you think I once ever thought about Catholic charities when we started the adoption process? I didn't. And a good soul sister, deep friend of mine said, "I'd like you to talk to some friends of mine. They adopted a son through Catholic charities, and they have what's called an open adoption." So Paul and I went over to these strangers' home, having no idea what to ask or say, and listened to this remarkable concept and story. Typical open adoptions, keyword typical as our story unfolds. Typical open adoptions is where it is legal and normal as a closed adoption, only you have some contact with a birth mother or a birth father, or maybe a birth grandparent, if they're healthy people, basically, the healthiness of the person. Meaning you might email or text a few times a year, share pictures and stories, and you might even meet once or twice a year in a neutral location on special occasions. So this is what the couple explained to us. And then their son came in when we were leaving. He was so cute, with his thick blonde hair, around 7 years old, and everything just looked so normal and so natural, and it sounded so healthy. And we walked out of there thinking, this is the healthiest, most common sense thing I've ever heard. After all, the best relationships are open, honest communications. This was beginning to be a very common way they did adoptions because agencies began to listen to the needs of the birth children and birth parents and even adoptive parents expressing this need. We started to do the paperwork, which is about this thick. And you create a photo album that has pictures and descriptions of who you are, your interests, careers, family, anything that you think they might want to know about you. And they say it's amazing what they're drawn to. They pick you from some connection. It can be as simple as a Braves hat or a golden retriever because they had a golden retriever. It's whatever God uses to move them to pick you from these albums. And we waited, and it was not long. We got a call that a girl had picked us to be her child's parents. I was painting someone's condo with a roller in my hand, and I could barely catch my breath as she said, and she's in the hospital, and she's delivered today. I didn't paint another stroke. I sat there with that roller in my hand, could barely move. And I said, Shanita, is it a boy or a girl? And she said, it's a girl. I said, girl? I've been waiting my whole life for this. 10 years, I never thought twice about it being a boy or girl until that moment. I thought, okay. I guess I could raise a girl as well as I could raise a boy. Typically in an open adoption, if you never met the birth parents to confirm their choice, or if there's any wavering in them that they are not completely convicted of adoption, they place the baby in foster care as they have 10 days to change their mind in the state of Georgia. So we were having fun. My cousin Karen picked me up and she bought me a crib and we bought a rocker. Then her brother set over a bouncy seat later on with some clothes, and my little sister brought over a bag of clothes, all in the same day. And on the 4th day, I was painting chocolate walls in the bathroom with big blue polka dots, waiting for Paul to get home so we could put up the crib. And Shanita called again and tell me that she had changed her mind. You see, that girl was a college student from a very strong family and a very strong support system, but her mother had died. And I believe strongly that had she been alive, she would have never even considered adoption. And I do believe our prayers prayed that baby back into that girl's arms as she felt the strength of her mother's prayers in heaven, that she was called to be her mother. And I was paralyzed with fear as I waited for Paul to come home to tell him. But when I told him, and we cried together, he looked at me and said, I think we should put the crib up anyways. The next day I went to Mass at Holy Cross, my church, where I have now been a member for 55 years, and everyone was walking around like this. But I was okay. I was at peace. It was God's will that I had prayed for, and it was a gift. It's a gift to get someone's child, and you can't take a gift that you haven't been given. And our closest family friend, who had a son that was David's age, one of his best friends, came up to me and she said, Caroline, when I heard it was going to be a girl, I thought, Caroline's not supposed to have a girl. It's the same thing. So that blow of a loss was at the end of 2006. And in late January, I was up on scaffolding painting a life-size deer in Eatonton, Georgia. And Shanita called. She said, we have a decision for you to make. We have 2 girls to show your album to, and you have to pick one because you can't show 2 in 1 week. One girl was using drugs and alcohol during her first trimester, and the second might be struggling with adoption. So please think about which one and get back to me. Well, after all I'd been through with just losing the girl, the last thing I wanted to do was choose. So I called one of my best friends, my mom, and the lady I was painting for, and asked them to pray for the decision. And I climbed back up on that scaffolding, shaking.
I didn't even care. I did not want to make that decision. I had to completely surrender it to God. Then that prayer was answered quickly. Shanita called back and said they made the decision for me. They were showing it to the girl that was struggling with adoption, and I said, that's just fine. But as you will see, she was not struggling at all. It was not the case at all. You see, just down the road, 30 minutes from where I was that day in Milledgeville, Georgia, was the most thoughtful, deepest, discerning, intelligent, mature, beautiful 20-year-old ever. She was not struggling with placing her baby for adoption at all. In fact, not only did she receive the phenomenal counseling and education that Catholic Charities provides, but she also sought out extra counseling through a psychologist who had been trained in adoptions, all while she was enrolled at UGA, and her name was Teresa. And she was just starting to date Josh, the birth father, the baby and they were expecting the baby in a few months. They had only dated a month when they were conceived. They hardly knew where their relationship was going, or even if they had one. And then they chose us from our adoption book to be the parents of their baby. And then came the day we would meet them and decide if we were the right ones for them to choose for placement. And let me tell you about that day. I have never been so nervous in my entire life. When we drove down to Catholic Charities, I did not say a word the whole way. I could not talk. And Paul finally looked at me and he goes, "What in the world is wrong with you? You haven't talked the whole time." And I said, "I am freaked out. I am so incredibly nervous." And my 250-pound former football player husband said, "What are you worried about? We're adorable." And in that room is where God began his divine work with Caroline, Paul, Josh, and Teresa. His grace was so evident on all of us, I could literally feel his presence in that room. And my nervousness went out the window. Paul and I were giddy, talking a million miles a minute, like two 14-year-olds. I just regurgitated my whole life, which is what I do. But Paul was right there with me. And I could tell the way Teresa's counselor was reacting to everything I was saying, my whole philosophy, morals, take on life, and was just how Teresa thought. It was evident that everyone knew we were a fit. Josh was 24 at the time, and he and Teresa had really started to move deeper into a committed relationship. And they were ready to deliver in a matter of months. He spoke quite a bit on their behalf, and at one point he stopped and said the most needed thing for us to hear, and said, "We want you to hear this. This is happening. We're not changing our mind. You will have this baby." And complete peace came over us, and we never ever doubted from that moment on we would be his parents, a baby boy. As we started to leave the room, Shanita said to Teresa, "Do you have a name picked out for him?" And she said, "No, I guess I could come up with one." And I chimed in, "Oh no, we're not just going to come up with one." I've been waiting my entire life since I was 14 years old to have a child named after my brother. I'd like to name him David. That was at the end of January. Dave was due in March. So those months I began doing what has guided me until this day, and I let guide in all my relationships. I did whatever God placed on my heart, and I did what came natural, despite fear of rejection or not being received. I started emailing her my thoughts, excitement, pictures of the room, the mural I painted, fabric I picked out. She was all I had to cling to until David was born. We began to grow very fond of each other and Josh as well. One day, she asked me to meet her out for coffee. She was a month away from delivery, and we talked for hours. She brought me pictures of the ultrasound and shared so much of her life with me and how her and Josh's relationship was developing. We looked at life so similarly. Raised Catholic, a big family. She was an artist, same weight, same height, only 20 years younger. One time she said to me,
I always hoped that I could find an adoptive mother that could paint murals in my baby's room like my mom painted in my room. I was like, Teresa, what are the chances that your adoptive mother's a muralist? Paul and I coached and mentored kids so much that I think our gift with young people really helped us develop that relationship with them. I often say through the adoption process, not only did they fall in love with each other, but they fell in love with us. So much so that the day David was born, Josh called us to come to the hospital to see him an hour after he was born. I was driving down Jimmy Carter at 12 o'clock, March 28th. By 1:30, we were at Athens Regional Hospital, the day I finally got to hold my very own baby. Josh and Teresa stayed in the hospital with David while she healed for 2 days until the day of placement with us. The day of placement was the happiest days of our life together, but it was the saddest for Josh and Teresa. And I was so worried about them. When we got there, Shanita said that they needed more time for us to go down to the cafeteria and get some lunch. We said, absolutely, tell them to take as long as they need. That moment after that is a blur. All I remember is walking with a tray and Shanita calling and saying they were ready to go, but they wanted to see us first. She said that is extremely rare and a huge sign of trust. I yelled to Paul. We threw our trays down, God only knows where, and I plowed through that hospital to find Josh standing in the middle of the hallway. And I hugged him so tight. And I said, where is she? And he pointed outside. And there she was, up against the wall with a robe on, and her belly was still big. And I hugged her, and she said, if this was anybody else, we could not have gone through with this. I said, you call me every single minute you need to check on him. The next day, they called and said they were going to the Braves game. That was the best. I knew if they were going to the Braves game, they were going to be okay. Years before we even thought about adoption, my mom came across this thing called an entrustment ceremony. It could be held in the hospital, a sanctuary, or home with the birth parents, an adoptive parents and preacher, a deacon, or a priest. God had us keep this because he knew it was going to be perfect for us one day. So I pulled it up to share it with Teresa, and she loved it. 10 days after David was born, we met in a little Catholic church in Athens, and all our families met for the first time. It's like a spiritual explanation of adoption. First, the birth parents hold the baby, they say a prayer over him, then they hand the baby to the deacon or priest or preacher, and he says a prayer, and then that deacon hands him to us, and we say a prayer over him. It's almost like a feeling of receiving a sacrament, deeply divine. In a typical open adoption, there's a negotiation that's established by the adoptive parents, like guidelines, how many times you might meet, how you'll communicate. But Josh told me one day, he said, we obviously have an unusual bond and wondered if we ought to just play this relationship by ear and see where it leads naturally. I couldn't have agreed more. And as you'll see, God did the leading. We are anything but typical. Mother Angelica, the nun who started the largest Christian radio station, now TV station, EWTN, says, if you want to know the will of God, watch what happens. With the most unwavering trust and the healthiest boundaries, we became family. As Josh says, it's not like we're special people, we're just blessed. We immediately started gathering for holidays, birthdays, graduations, baptisms, spending the night together. Anything a family does together, we do, as often as God leads us. When David was baptized, Josh and Teresa came to Holy Cross, and I gave him a little room to the side, and they put his gown on him. This is when Teresa graduated from UGA with her first degree. These are Teresa's parents, Jimmy and Kathy. This is a baptism baptism for Teresa's sister Elaine's first child. Christmas, he looks just like Teresa. His first day at kindergarten at IGM. This is Haley, Josh's sister, and her first child, Lanier. Just dinner. Christmas. Teresa's sister Mary's first wedding. Jimmy, her dad, is in a band, and he played at the reception. David played the tambourine at the reception the entire time. She always says, he looks just like us, and then he opens his mouth. David's first communion, that's Tony, that's Josh's dad. These are Teresa's parents came up to Maine, all the way up to Maine, and hung out with us for a few days at my in-laws' lake house. David pulling Kathy on the jet ski. God has done many things through David's birth. When Josh and his sister Haley's parents divorced, they couldn't be in the same room for 10 years. They had to do everything separate, holidays and birthdays. But since the entrustment ceremony, that relationship has been completely healed. Anytime I ask Josh's dad to get together, he always says, "Can I call Debbie and bring Debbie?" When David was 9 months old, at his first Christmas, Josh's sister had us over for a family Christmas, where we met aunts and uncles and their grandmother for the first time. His mom told me the story, how much pain and animosity there were between the two of them for 10 years, and that David brought more love into the world. And God did use David's birth for the most healing, miraculous event of all. Back when Teresa was first telling her parents she was pregnant and was researching open adoption concept, her mother, Kathy, emphatically disagreed and hit Teresa with something she never saw coming. Kathy knew personally about a closed adoption, and she knew that closed adoption was the way to go because she had placed a baby girl for adoption long before she had met Teresa's father. She had no idea where she was, but knew it was best. Though this was a blow to Teresa and her two sisters, she knew she was not going to do it that way and had complete conviction in open adoption. Do you know the day David was born? When Teresa's parents jumped in the car to come to Athens, Kathy stopped at the bell box to get mail to look at on the way up. She opened up a letter from Texas, where she was raised, to find a letter from her birth daughter, who wanted to meet her. March 28, 2007, the day David was born. By that summer, Teresa had brought her mom to that same psychologist that was trained in adoption to prepare her to meet her birth daughter, 30-year-old Jocelyn, in Texas. And she's been a sister to Teresa ever since. That's all the sisters and Kathy. They all look exactly alike. And David looks just like them. Sisters. Teresa and Josh moved to Colorado when David was just over a year old and enrolled in Denver Law School. And Josh got his master's in business. When David was 3 years old, they got married. David was the ring bearer, and I read in their wedding. Rather, I cried through the entire thing. It ended up being a toast that you can't give. I was not able to put in a toast ever to put into words what all they have done for us, but everyone got why I was crying. I said, David, did you like all walking down the aisle and all those people looking at you? And he said, I was grumpy. He explained it. This is a picture Teresa gave me. You can see David's arm between us. David's actually very camera savvy now. He does filming and stuff, so it's interesting that he has that. But she wrote on the back of the picture, this picture is worth 1,000 words. Paul really wanted to give them a really nice wedding gift, or at least it was nice for us. and it was a check. And when Josh opened it, when we were heading back to Atlanta, he texted thanking us. Sadly, it's on an old flip phone. And he said, and if we had the chance to do it all again, we'd do it exactly the same. It took a while for them to be ready to have their own child, and that conception did not come easy. They were pregnant July of 2016. We were overwhelmed with joy that David would have a baby sister. However, they immediately had complications. She bled daily and thought she had a miscarriage all the time. Carrying her full term looked very, very dismal. We had unbelievable hope, but we had to be realistic too. We had everyone praying harder and more intensely than we have ever prayed. Her cervix was 2.5 centimeters long. When she would do similar research stories, no one had anything to compare. They were at least 5 centimeters. At one point, I said, they say it's important to name babies that are in the threat of being miscarried or have been miscarried or lost for any reason. Have y'all thought of a name for her? And she said, we jokingly call her Embry, short for embryo. And both of us have aunts named Louise, so we call her Embry Lou. One day when they were at the doctor's office around 15 weeks, they called me to ask me for advice. They were faced with the decision of having a cerclage. It's like a drawstring that keeps the cervix from opening up too soon. Me, their birth son's mother, who has never birthed a child. I often say Josh and Teresa had better boundaries than I do, but I had a rare place in their lives. Anyone else would be too close to the situation. I had the unique position of being objective and subjective at the same time. I ran up into the guest room, shut the door, so I could be more present to them, and so I could hear and be guided by the Holy Spirit and comfort them with my answer. I said, you do whatever you have to do to save her life. We have to fight for her. Believe in her. Believe in this doctor, but by the grace of God, believes he can save her. So Embry Lou stayed for a few more weeks. Then they called me again from a doctor's office, faced with the same type of question. They needed to do another cerclage. The first was loosening up too much. This time I said, I think you just needed to hear my voice. You know what you want to do and what you will do, and you just need an affirmation. And I just want to say a prayer with you. And they did another cerclage, and it worked. Embry Louise was born 4 months early. At 25 weeks, 1 pound, 1 ounce. November 29th, 2016. Look at her little figure next to Teresa's. And that was actually a baby doll outfit. She stayed in the NICU until March, her original birth date. In June, my good friend gave us our frequent flyer miles, and the 3 of us met David's little sister for the very first time. Embry has no signs of delays whatsoever. We see her as often as we can and take trips even together. In March of 2020, they moved to Athens, 1 hour and 4 minutes from us. This is her baptism. She wasn't feeling too good. See how pretty they are. This is in Savannah. I love this picture. They just recently came with us. These are David's birth cousins from Haley. Embry on the end at my pool in my neighborhood. I love this picture too. That's a brother and sister right there. He's not even paying attention to her, and she's exasperated. This is from Teresa's sister's wedding. She was a flower girl. I love that picture. You can see how much her bed looks like. These are 2 cousins from Teresa's sister, Elaine. Just hanging out on the couch. People often ask if David understands his birth a family and how do they act around each other? And what does he call them? They're like really, really close aunts and uncles. He calls them by their names. He has understood since he was 2 years old, making jokes about being in her belly, that our dog must have been in there too because he has big brown eyes like him. For years he would tell us there was a sofa in the womb, a hot tub, and a disco ball. He said that's where he learned this move. Whenever Teresa would jump around. When we thought we could lose Embry, we prayed for her every night, but I couldn't explain physically what the problem was. When she was born, I knew it was a good time to teach him about the reproductive system, and he would start having a lot more questions, especially now Josh fits into the equation. He was 9 years old now. I read a Christian book to him on reproductive system, and it was blowing his mind. He had no idea we had different body parts. He was serious and very attentive. But when we got to the cervix, I stopped to explain that this was the problem when Teresa was pregnant with Embry. As serious as ever, he said, "Oh yeah, I remember the cervix." I said, "You do?" He said, "Oh yeah, there was a sign down there. It said, 'Do not go beyond this point.'" Because I didn't know what a calendar was back then. They had a couple of other ones that said 1 month more, 2 months more. And with that, he quickly went back to the book, asking me to continue. I called Teresa and I said, "I don't think Embry's going to be quite the rule follower David is." She didn't read the signs. And David understands having a birth sister on a deeper level. When he was in the 6th grade, he was asked to write a memoir in English. I had no idea. He asked if he could read it to me on the way home from school. I about drove off the side of the road with emotion. I'd like to read a little bit of it for you right now. 6th grade. Most people celebrate when the baby is born. Well, when she was born, we prayed that she'd live just 1 more hour. I still remember that day. It was raining, and I was sitting on the carpet playing Legos, half watching TV. It was quite early as I remember it. The day was regular until my mom got a text. I heard the text ding and didn't even care about it until she said, "She's here." "What?" I replied. "She's born, your sister." Now you would probably expect for me to be happy or euphoric, but I was not. Looking at the date, I saw it was November. She was due in March, kind of like when you're baking something and it's supposed to be done at 5, but it comes out at 1. She was undercooked. She was like that, underdeveloped. So instead of being exuberant, I had kind of a fearful face with a scribbled up look like a baby who just tried a lemon. Now, if you're wondering if your mom is right there, how was your sister born? Well, it's a lot, but to make a long story short, I'm adopted. And I know my birth parents and family, but my mom is my mom, who I live with. Even if I didn't come out of her, she's my mom. So my birth mom had a baby, which makes her my sister. About an hour after she was born, we started getting pictures. First was a picture of her in her little bed in the NICU, looking so tiny and cute. Next, to show how small she was, my birth mom, Teresa, took a picture of her diaper next to a lipstick container. The diaper was smaller. She was smaller than her mother's hand. Now we prayed and prayed for her to live, and we kept getting pictures and videos from the NICU. During her first bath, they used alcohol swabs that almost fully covered her body. Right before Christmas, she was big enough to wear her first outfit. Fast forward March, 4 months later, she's doing well. So well, she was getting out of the NICU, which at that point was the only place she knew. We were planning at that time an amazing summer. We were first going to Colorado to see the one and only my sister. I was totally pumping with energy, as excited as finding a $100 bill under a car in the middle of the CVS parking lot. When we went to the nursery, I realized how much she had gone through. I saw the Raggedy Ann that my grandma from Maine had given her, and the gifts we gave her, then I saw her. She was doing amazing, and she still is to this day, 2 years later. But I'll always keep Embry, my unbelievable sister, in my prayers. I can't believe I have a sister that I can love the rest of my life. Teresa did not get much help from the doctors regarding her pregnancy with Embry compared to such a normal pregnancy to David. So, in true Teresa form, she researched it and figured it out herself. A few weeks after Dave was born, she started hemorrhaging and went to the emergency room for a D&C. The doctor had left some placenta in her cervix. It was so traumatic and emotionally rattling after just weeks of her placing her baby for adoption. She learned that those can cause scar tissue to develop and interfere with pregnancies. So she scheduled a surgery in Boston to remove the scar tissue. And on August 15, 2021, Arthur Allen England was born. And now David and Embry have a brother.
Sorry. Thank you.
Our story continues, and David will be able to have a lifetime with his siblings and family, even after we're gone. I always thought I'd have 4 boys, but God's plans are way more beautiful than mine. God gave me 1 boy and 2 families. We tried to adopt again when David was 2, after months of no birth mothers placing their children at Catholic charities. So they had to end adoptions and meet the needs of the community in another way. I can still have trouble holding other newborns, but not with Arthur. God healed me there with his birth family. The family I continue to try and thank for what they did for us and keep doing for us. Gave David the siblings I couldn't give him, and helping me heal every time I hold his siblings. Because I'm so deeply grateful they get to have children of their own. It took me 10 years of infertility, 10 years for 2 kids to grow up, get through middle school, get through high school, and move entirely too fast in their relationship to conceive our son, David Paul Camick.